Hey guys, it's Shortcakey. How you doing? Hope you're doing good. Today we're going to be doing 15 photos from mental asylums. The phrase mental asylum has an old-fashioned ring to it, like something you would read in a novel set in the Victorian era or the facade of an abandoned building. But actually, it's still a term that continues to be used to this day, meaning pretty much the same thing as psychiatric hospital or mental hospital. A hospital that specializes in the treatment of serious mental illnesses. Modern-day asylums are focused on evidence-based treatment that aims to help patients control their own lives and the outside world whenever possible. But most people can't help but imagine disturbing images of straitjackets and patients being electrocuted. This list I have here shows that this isn't just imaginary. In some time periods and places, mental asylums have been the site of some unnerving events. So brace yourselves. Coming in at number 15, reaching out. For many of us who have never experienced mental illness firsthand, the notion of being in a place full of mentally ill people is terrifying, especially if you don't have much education on psychological disorders. Chances are you will imagine all mental asylum patients as being harmful and utterly unpredictable. While this is not actually the case, people with mental disorders are more likely to harm themselves than others. Many of us probably think that the risks justify locking them away from other people. This photo of a patient's arm reaching out from inside a door labeled only number 5 reminds us that there is a human inside yearning for contact. But at the same time, it makes us wonder what would happen if that hand were to touch us. Number 14. To wave or not to wave? The East Louisiana State Hospital was beautifully designed in the style of Greek temples, which was intentionally done so that the institution would not look like, at all, a prison. Reports from visitors suggest that the institution's grand facade hid conditions that were less than ideal. Holes in the roof and lack of heating were just some of the conditions described by a visitor named Martha Field. She also noted how patients were segregated by gender and race, but not in terms of their conditions. Those with violent tendencies who might need to be restrained at times were huddled together with individuals with completely different illnesses. Maybe that explains this unsettling juxtaposition of a man in a straitjacket, arms immobilized, with another man right behind him, waving to the camera. Number 13. Show some restraints. If you ever visited Michigan, you may have heard of the Traverse City State Hospital, also known as the Northern Michigan Asylum and the Traverse City Regional Psychiatric Hospital. Established in 1881, some of the hospital's buildings are still standing but abandoned, and there are persisting rumors of flickering lights in rooms without power, shadows moving about the hallways, and voices in empty rooms. Whether or not you're the kind of person who gets creeped out by such stories, you will probably be disturbed by this image taken in the asylum in the 1890s, showing a woman standing in a narrow cell, held in place with standing restraints that keep her arms affixed to the wall. Maybe we should just be glad the photo doesn't show her face. Number 12. Nowhere to go. Just a glance at this image is enough to make us feel both unsettled and deeply sad. This photo was taken at an institution in Oklahoma called the Norman State Hospital, which in the 1890s was a privately owned facility called the Norman Institution for Violent Insane. That name in itself already gives us an idea of how many mentally ill patients were viewed and treated in that facility. But according to records, even after the place was renamed, its staff continued to use treatments now considered inhumane, such as electric and insulin shock therapy, sterilizations, and lobotomies. All this makes us wonder about the two people in this image and what sorts of treatments they had undergone and what they were thinking in this captured moment. Number 11. Strapped in. Have you ever felt so restless that you can't sit still and tried to find ways to curb your urge to fidget? Maybe you tried drinking some hot tea or immersing yourself in a good book to calm yourself down. Whatever techniques you tried, I hope it wasn't nothing as extreme as this restraint chair used in institutions such as the West Riding Pauper Lunatic Asylum in Wakefield, Yorkshire, in the UK, where this photo was taken in 1869. Modern restraint chairs, which are used to prevent an individual from causing injury to themselves and others, involve the use of straps around the wrist, ankles, and waist. But based on the expression on this man's face in this image, this vintage version looks much, much more comfortable. Even painful. Yikes. And here we have number 10, getting steamy and not in a good way. Have you ever had to deal with a friend who was getting a little too agitated and needed to calm down? Maybe you tried taking them to a quiet place, talking to them in soothing tones, or just maybe asking them about what was causing them to be agitated in the first place. But I am willing to bet that you never considered putting them into a large, steam-filled cabinet with just their head outside, because that's totally what you need when you're freaking out, right? 3 women being subjected to this treatment are shown in this image, and even if it might look relatively harmless, keep in mind that they had no choice or consent in being enclosed in a giant box for unknown periods of time. Number 9. So much for human dignity. I can only imagine how difficult it must have been to operate a mental health facility. Even today, there are many unanswered questions about how mental illnesses affect different individuals and how best to treat people with such conditions. But despite the challenges of understanding and treating mental disorders, I cannot imagine that there was a time when people thought it was acceptable to keep mentally presumed ill people in a facility where they would be huddled together, unclothed, while their excrement accumulated in the hallways. These were the conditions revealed by photos such as this one taken at the male incontinent ward of the Philadelphia State Hospital at Bayberry. Try not to look at the image too long or to imagine what it must have smelled like. Number 8. Cornered. Award-winning photographer Georgiou spent the years 1999 to 2002 working in Kosovo and Siberia on a project about the aftermath of the NATO conflict with Siberia. While working on this project, he also spent time visiting mental health asylums in Siberia in order to document how mentally ill patients were treated in these institutions. His work exposed what he described in his blog as filthy conditions, contagious diseases, lack of medical care and rehabilitation, and failure to provide oversight due to low-paid staff struggling with their own difficulties. One of these images he captured shows a patient restrained in a straitjacket and seemingly tied to the corner of a room whose face looks anguished, making you wonder just how long that person was kept there and why. Number 7. Not your usual kiddie chair. You probably remember being made to sit in kiddie chairs that were different from the chairs that grown-ups sat on, like high chairs when you're sitting down to eat at the dining room table, with your little legs dangling down with seemingly no chance of ever reaching the ground. Maybe you enjoyed having your own special perch that allows you to sit at the same level as the adults. Sort of. Or maybe you couldn't wait until you were big enough to use the grown-ups' chairs. Either way, you probably never imagined that there were much, much worse ways of seating children, like this children's chair, said to have been used in the lunatic room of a Dutch hospital in the 1930s. We'll stick to our high chairs. Thanks. Number 6. Naked Despair. The next image here on this list is from an institution that has already appeared twice here in the Philadelphia State Hospital at Bayberry. Many of y'all will probably agree to that this photo, showing a group of men huddled naked against a wall with looks of utter despair on their faces, is indeed an unsettling one. But some might wonder, why were there so many photos of patients there? The main reason is that in the 1940s, a number of the conscientious objectors, men who refused to fight in World War II, were instead assigned to work in state mental hospitals. Some of them were appalled at the conditions they found, such as those shown in this image, and became determined to expose these conditions to convince the state to change things. Number 5. Children at play. For many people, there's something particularly distressing about the thought of children with mental illnesses, especially with those conditions that are severe enough to necessitate confinement in a facility. Maybe it's because we're used to thinking of children as innocent and carefree beings whose only concern is when they can get to play with each other. Sadly, children can suffer from mental disorders just as adults can. This photo here, captured by award-winning photographer Eugene Richards, shows 3 patients in the children's ward of the Jalisco Psychiatric Hospital in Mexico. At first glance, one might think that the kids in this photo are just bored or listless. But then you notice that at least one of them is restrained to the wall using a cloth tie. A disturbing sight indeed. Number 4. Rubadubdub. Haven't we all had those exhausting days where it feels like the only thing that can make us feel like ourselves again is a nice, long soak in the tub? Many of us can probably attest to the idea of baths as a form of therapy, and apparently this notion was once put to use in mental asylums, albeit in a much more sinister form. The practice of hydrotherapy from the 1930s to the 1950s involved greasing patients to avoid pruning, and then submerging them in tubs of water for hours at a time, as the photos shows here. While the treatment is initially intended to calm down mentally ill patients, records suggest it was often abused and even used as punishment for patients who were difficult to control. Number 3, line up to light up. So far on this list, I've shown you images from mental asylums in Western countries, mostly in different parts of the U.S. Maybe you're wondering, what about the facilities for mentally ill people in other parts of the world? Are there similarly disturbing photos and stories of inhumane treatments and abuse? Or is it a completely different scenario? This picture gives us a glimpse into a typical day in modern mental hospital in Tehran, the capital of Iran. It is not actually as distressing as it might seem at first glance. It simply shows patients lining up to receive 3 cigarettes, a nightly ritual at that facility, but with reports of patients being made to stay immobile for hours. Wonder what else is going on there. Number 2, what a shocker. From books like The Bell Jar and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest to films like Requiem for a Dream, electroconvulsive therapy is a psychiatric treatment that has been depicted many times in works of fiction, often not in a favorable way. Today, electroconvulsive therapy, in which seizures are electrically induced in patients to provide relief from mental illnesses, is actually an accepted form of treatment for conditions including major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder, although it is mainly viewed as a last resort. But the notion still elicits many fears among the general public. After all, its early forms involved restraining patients physically instead of anesthetizing them before the treatment. That's exactly what is shown in this photograph at Fiora Hospital in New Zealand, taken in 1956. And number 1, in chains. This photo, we are taken back to the Philadelphia State Hospital at Bayberry. But this time, what we see is not a group of naked men, but a solitary man who is restrained to a narrow hospital bed. According to this caption, this photo was taken in the violent ward of the institution, which may explain, at least partly, why this patient was being restrained. But before we jump to conclusion that this was the only way to prevent this patient from harming themselves or others, we should keep in mind that reports and investigations by various individuals and organizations, including the Mental Health Association of Southeastern Pennsylvania, describe various problems at the hospital, many of which were related to the arbitrary and overly frequent use of restraints. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed. If you did, leave a like, leave a comment. Don't forget to subscribe. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram. Love you guys. Smooches and hugs. Mwah!